Hello, my confirmation students. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the Torah, or the Pentateuch. So Pentateuch, just like Pentagon has 5 sides, Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. So that would be Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. The Pentateuch is also known as the Torah. The Torah being a Hebrew word for these first 5 books of the Bible, a Hebrew word that means law or instruction. The word Torah, although meaning law or instruction, also is based in grace. So the Pentateuch, the Torah, these first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are the first 5 books telling the start of the story of God's chosen people. We've covered a lot of Genesis already. The story of Abraham, his son Isaac, Jacob. The Exodus, we started last week. Exodus is where Moses goes and asks Pharaoh to let my people go, leading the Hebrew people out of Egypt, across the dried bed of the Red Sea, into the wilderness on the other side, into freedom as God's chosen people. Then in Exodus, we also have the Hebrew people, God's chosen people, who instead of listening to the laws of God, listening to the way that God would like them to live, they decide to make bad decisions. They choose sin and greed over God's abundance of manna and mercy, God's abundance of grace and of food. So, as a result, the Hebrew people end up being stuck to wander in the desert for 40 years. And these 40 years is what the rest of the Pentateuch, the rest of the Torah, is telling us. God chooses to use these 40 years to teach the Hebrew people how to live according to God's way, a way that is different from the system, the structure in Egypt of oppression and hierarchy, to live in a way that's based on abundance for all. So if you read through the book of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll find lots and lots of detailed laws, lots and lots of detailed instructions and rules on how God wants God's chosen people to live. Leviticus talks a lot about sacrificial worship, dietary laws, sometimes you hear the word kosher, talks about purity versus impurity. Leviticus also gives the Holy Code, which is a sanctified communal life, so how to live a holy life as a community together. Numbers gives a lot of the story of wandering in the wilderness and God's guidance, and Deuteronomy finishes up with Moses' last teachings and reminders from God before they reach the promised land. Moses gives them more instructions about the covenant between God and the Hebrew people, the same covenant that we as Christians inherit through Jesus. So the covenant between God and us is what it ultimately becomes. We'll get more into this covenant, another word for promise, in next week's lesson. We'll get into more details about what the word covenant means and what God's covenant is between us and God. And in the final part of Deuteronomy, the last part of the Torah, Moses passes on his authority to Joshua. And unfortunately, Moses never makes it to the promised land. He dies right before they cross into the promised land. Tradition says it was Moses that wrote the Torah, the Pentateuch. But more recently, scholars believe that there were 4 different authors in the Pentateuch, and their writings have all been combined to make what we know today to be the Pentateuch, or the Torah, our first 5 books of the Bible. Now, as you read through these first 5 books of the Bible, as you read through the Torah, especially Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, there get to be a lot of details that don't really seem all that relevant, or can be very confusing as you read through them. That's because all of these details, all of these laws and instructions that God is giving the Hebrew people, they were all designed for a particular time and place. They were designed to be lived out by the Hebrew people as they wandered in the desert some 5,000 years ago. Some of the rules they had back then in how to live a sanctified communal life, how to live a holy life as a community, were much more relevant back then. But the spirit of those rules we carry to today. We take those rules and we say, this is what they meant then and there, and we're going to take the meaning behind them, the reason why God gave them these rules, and transfer that to how we live our lives today, a life that is filled with abundant mercy and manna for all. From chapter 3, our author, Dan Erlander, in Manna and Mercy, names the Pentateuch the wilderness school. The wilderness school is these 40 years that the Hebrew people are wandering the desert before they get to the promised land. The wilderness school is where God wants the Hebrew people to learn how to live in friendship with God, in friendship with others, and in friendship with nature. Through the manna, God teaches us an abundance of food, an abundance of provisions, that God will always provide everything that we need and more. We also learn from the manna that hoarding stinks. Saving up more than what we need isn't going to do us good in the long run. And we learn the gift of Sabbath, the gift of being able to take a day to rest, take a day to just focus on God. In this wilderness school, in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, we learn that everything comes from God and is a gift to us to use for God's sake and the sake of our neighbors. That God gives us enough for each and every one of us, and all of that can be shared with all people. That hoarding doesn't do anybody any good. So as God's chosen people, as the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, if they can figure out how to live according to the rules that they learn in the wilderness school, if we can learn to live like God wanted the Hebrew people to live, in a life that's filled with abundance of manna, a Sabbath rest for all, and where nobody is hoarding up stockpiles, that then we can live a life that is centered on friendship with God, friendship with others, and friendship with nature, just as God intended. Sometimes this is more of a challenge than it is easy. But the hard work of living this life always pays off in the end. That's all for now. Thanks for joining me. See you soon.